And we're going to move right into our next presentation. We're going to invite Joel Kearns back into audio visual world while Ricky resets the timer.
Okay, thank you.
All right, very good, Joel. Take it away.
Thank you. Well, I'm Joel Kearns. You heard earlier at the Federated Board session, I'm the new Deputy Associate Administrator for Exploration and Science Mission Directorate. And as part of that, I get to lead up the Exploration Science Strategy and Integration Office at SMD and manage the Lunar Discovery and Exploration Program. And I'll give you an update. Now, I'm lucky enough that I got to go after Sarah Noble, who is part-time part of our office. So she was able to provide you some, I think, some very important information, particularly related to what we're looking at for upcoming Artemis planning, some of which I won't repeat here in my presentation. Go to the next chart, please. So again, our implementation strategy for human exploration-related science, both the strategy and the integration of making that happen, particularly related to the moon, these are the elements of the Lunar Discovery and Exploration Program. You've probably seen these in the past. I won't read them. They have not changed. There are several elements that you've heard Sarah, Kevin, Jim, and others talk about. The thing that probably people pay a lot of interest to right now in the early phase are the commercial lunar payload delivery services, CLPS, and the instruments and payloads that go with them. I pay a lot of attention, as you can imagine, to the scientific instruments that we're preparing for it. But CLPS is also delivering technology developments, both payloads and inline, and also exploration, data gathering, and operations equivalent of supplementary objectives we used to do in human spaceflight on some of the missions to gather data for those organizations also. If you go to the next chart, please. Now, something I always enjoy is that when NASA discusses its near-term human exploration plans, and of course we talk about the Artemis crewed missions, they're usually almost always preceded by a mention of lunar discovery and exploration or commercial lunar payload services, as is shown here, where there's an illustration of Viper being sent to the South Pole of the Moon, as Sarah talked about, but also talking about how we have a longstanding program for Mars exploration that's also going on. That is scientific studies in their own right, but they also inform what eventually NASA will do with crewed missions to the surface of Mars. Next chart, please. And I have taken over from Dave Burns, who has returned from Marshall Space Flight Center, who's returned to his permanent assignment as Director of the Science and Technology Office at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. I think you folks are probably aware that over the year, last year, Dr. Deborah Needham has joined this office, as well as Dr. Ryan Watkins. And it's a relatively small office, which again is focused particularly on strategy and integration across the SMD scientific divisions, as well as integration with human exploration and the Space Technology Organization, other government agencies that want to do science of or from the moon, as well as potential international partners. And when we talk about science strategy and integration, as you can imagine, a lot of it are things related to planetary science. But as Jim Spann mentioned earlier, not all of it is. There's also studies in astrophysics. There are potential studies in astrophysics. There are studies that Jim talked about in heliophysics and space physics. And there's even been discussion of potential studies related to Earth science being done from the vantage point of the moon. So our role is to make sure that strategy is in place, not only for near-term robotic missions, but also for the scientific studies that will actually be done by the Artemis crews, eventually by the Artemis base camp in the sustainment phase, and then branching out from that to other destinations. If you go to the next chart, please. I want to focus a little bit on instruments and payloads. I think you're all aware that the initial suites of instruments came from a call internal to NASA called NASA Provided Lunar Payloads, and these were using existing instruments or copies of instruments or engineering units of instruments for the initial CLPS deliveries as a way to make sure that the payloads were ready and instrument and science complements could be formed and as early as those CLPS companies can make those deliveries. And then this was expanded where there was an internal call for what's called lunar surface instruments and technology payloads, where then again things had to be almost ready to go or very far through their development or very straightforward to raise their technology readiness level for. But companies and universities were allowed to propose payloads again for some of the early CLPS delivery missions. Well, now we're implementing a more formal, structured, competitive call called Payloads and Research Investigations for the Surface of the Moon, or PRISM. It'll be a recurring call. I see it going on once a year. The PRISM 1 selections are expected very soon. And this call, I'll remind you, for PRISM 1 requested science investigations utilizing multi-instrument suites to maximize the science for the landing locations that NASA had identified. And NASA identified those landing locations, as I said earlier, based on earlier community advisory input, based on our alignment with the previous decadal study priorities that were given by the Academy to NASA. Any updates or methods to satisfy those priorities, which have been generated in the meantime since the last decadals for those areas, say through advisory committees or league or other bodies. And from that, and also looking at what NASA's goals are for human exploration, where, as you all know, the Artemis landing sites, at least the initial sites, will be at the south pole of the moon, where we'll be able to look at volatiles, potentially their use for to support human activities on the moon. Particular landing sites are selected. The ones for PRISM 1 are for Rainier Gamma, and also for Schrodinger Basin. And that's the call that went out for PRISM 1 and for which we're close to making selections. So we've already started drafting the community announcement for the PRISM 2, which will tell you what NASA's view is of what the next set of identified landing locations will be. But if you read the Artemis Science Definition Team report, you're familiar with the decadal and the league and all the work that's been done for years. It'll make sense, I think, what those landing locations are. And again, these PRISM calls will occur on a regular cadence coming up. And as Sarah said, we're looking right now at how to implement a participating scientist program for each of those PRISM deliveries. Now, those are the ones I just talked about. For PRISM, most of those, they're scientific studies that are sponsored by SMD. In addition to that, of course, there's payloads and inline technology from Space Technology Mission Directorate and ESSIO. Some of those in the near term are relatively small things. They're science instrument-sized things that'll fly on CLPS. In the far term, they could be actually quite big. They could be big deliveries on the order of Viper or larger in the out years. If you go to the next chart, please. Now, our current portfolio, we show here, we've got 14 companies in our IDIQ pool that we can then solicit from to get proposals to make deliveries and provide certain capabilities to send instruments to the surface of the moon or to cislunar space. 6 are signed and firmed up that are listed on the bottom. If you read the news, you probably saw in Space News published yesterday that they published that SpaceX has notified Intuitive Machines that the flight that Intuitive Machines planned for launch in November this year, that SpaceX can't support that because of their launch manifest, and they are working with Intuitive Machines to reschedule that launch for the first quarter of 22. I know Intuitive Machines is really disappointed by that. We are, but of course they've contracted to get their ride from a very experienced provider, and Intuitive Machines is working with SpaceX now to narrow down, based on NASA's needs and IM's needs, what the exact launch opportunity should be in the first quarter. It's really difficult for these providers to work, as you can imagine, through the coronavirus pandemic. In many cases, they're building their landers for their first time, and they're having to work really hard through the supplier delays and constraints. As of this point, Astrobiotic is still telling us that they expect to launch their first delivery mission for us in the last quarter of this calendar year. And we can see the other providers, even in the later years, fighting really hard to get their supply base firmed up during the coronavirus so that they can go forward on the schedules that we've laid out. And I would say that, for many of these CLPS providers, they view these initial deliveries as they're going in demonstrations so they can get more business from NASA, from other government agencies, from international space agencies, from other corporations that would like to do work on the moon. So they have a lot of incentive to try to meet their delivery dates, not just the fact that we contracted with them to deliver these instruments. Next chart, please. So here's our delivery sites for the first agreed CLPS missions listed here with their providers and the dates. As I said, the date, unfortunately, for Intuitive Machines in the upper left is now out of date, and we'll find the new date, I'm sure, relatively soon. And of course, because we haven't selected the PRISM instrument suites yet for Mariner Gamma or Schrodinger Basin, we have not, and we won't select the CLPS delivery organizations until we have those instrument suites selected and defined. But you can also see the concentration here of the number of sites, 3 out of the 6 we have so far, all at the south pole of the moon. Next chart, please. I also want to take this opportunity to introduce the selection of the first 4 NASA project scientists who will work with all the instrument developers, the payload developers that will fly CLPS delivery missions. Susan Lederer, who will work with Intuitive Machines for their first delivery early in 22. Paul Niles is going to be working with Astrobiotic for their first delivery targeted for the end of this year. John Gruner, who's going to be working with Master Space Systems, and Maria Banks will be working with Firefly. When we make the selections for the PRISM 1 suites, we'll announce the project scientists that'll be assigned to the Mariner Gamma and the Schrodinger Basin deliveries. Next chart, please. And then I want to say a few words about our CLPS philosophy. Again, if you're not familiar with this, we are purchasing a delivery service. We want to, at NASA, be one of many customers for the people making these delivery services. We actually don't own the mission. They're doing a delivery for us. We provide the scientific and the technology instruments, and we tell them what data we need back from our instruments, and they have to get it to the surface or into cislunar space if we ever have one that just goes to cislunar space in the future, and provide that back. If you go to the next chart, please. And as again, I pointed out, our focus is on strategy and integration of science related to the human exploration beyond Earth orbit, beyond space station. So one of our big focuses on the Artemis 3 SDT report for the surface science that will be carried out by the flight crew members, maybe in concert with other instruments that have already been delivered to the surface, and how we integrate that among all the participating parties. Next chart, please. You'll probably hear later, I'm sure, from Renee Weber about what the candidate science program is for the first Artemis crewed landing, what the major goals are. We recognize that a successful surface mission, the science output of that hinges on addressing all of the program elements that were defined. Now that we're getting better insight into who the first crewed landing demonstrator provider will be, and we'll know in the future who potential other providers might be providing future crewed delivery services to the human to the surface of the moon, we'll get a much better understanding of, in fact, how much can be done in what order on particular landing missions where we have the crew there available to do science. Next chart, please. And I also want to remind everybody that Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter is still going strong after many years in orbit, generating a ton of data used by both science and by exploration planning. And if you go to the next chart, please. LRO produces a lot of products every month. They help us in planning our CLPS activities coming up, the investigations for CLPS, Artemis planning, other investigations related to the moon. And as you can imagine, we are looking at now in the future, someday there will need to be a successor to LRO, or at least a similar functions and capabilities. And we're currently starting to look at that. Next chart, please. So I want to thank you all for letting me have the time to talk. I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Joel.